Good morning, church family. It's day 5 in our Vision Prayer Week, in which we have been exploring how each and every one of us can be a witness for Jesus, often without saying anything at all. One of the most powerful ways we can witness for Christ is to embrace suffering as servants of Christ. Now, what do we mean by that exactly? Well, a few years back, certain Chicago Bear fans started calling Wisconsin Packer fans cheeseheads. Well, instead of reacting to that negatively, Wisconsin residents embraced it. Said, "You bet, we are cheeseheads," and they even started wearing foam cheese blocks on their head at Lambeau Field and sitting on their couches in their living room. After all, where does the best cheese in America come from? Right here in Wisconsin, right? So we chose to own that identity instead of taking it as an insult, taking cheesehead as an insult. We claimed it as our identity. And we must do the same thing as believers in Jesus Christ. Instead of taking it as an insult when people call us Christian or despise us for our faith, instead, we must claim that as our identity. Peter talks about this in his epistle throughout, almost in every chapter. In chapter 2, for example, he says, "But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it?" Here he's speaking to slaves. "But if you suffer for doing good and endure it, this is commendable before God. To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. When they hurled insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly." And so, what Peter says here is that that's actually part of our calling. That's an amazing statement, that we are called to a life of suffering because Jesus suffered. And if we're going to follow Christ, we can expect to suffer as well. Well, Peter goes on to say, and here he's not speaking to slaves, this is in chapter 3. He says, "But even if you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear their threats. Do not be frightened, but in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer for everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect." And so, what Peter is saying here is that if we're willing to suffer for the cause of Christ, if we're willing to suffer indignity or insult or even opposition and persecution and loss for the cause of Christ, that creates an opportunity for us to share with anyone who asks the hope that is in us. And so we really have to think about that and say, okay, uh, before anyone asks us that question, we have to answer it for ourselves. We have to ask ourselves, why am I a Christian? Why do I follow Christ? Why am I willing to suffer and to give up things, time and money or whatever it is in order to serve Christ? Why am I willing to do that? So that when somebody else asks you that, you'll be ready with an answer. Peter goes on to say, and that was in chapter 2 and then in chapter 3, but then in chapter 4, he goes on to say, that therefore, since Christ has suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves also with this same purpose, because the one who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, so as to live the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for human lust, but for the will of God. So when we are willing to suffer for the gospel, it sort of cements in our hearts and minds our conviction to serve Christ. And we're not saved by suffering. It's the sufferings of Christ that purchases our salvation. But our suffering is redemptive for us in that it cements our conviction to follow Christ, but also it provides an opportunity, a redemptive opportunity in other people's lives to tell them what Christ has done for us. And then finally, at the end of the chapter, at the end of chapter 4, Peter goes on to say, Dear friends, do not be surprised at the fiery ordeal that has come on to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice inasmuch as you participate in the sufferings of Christ, so that you may be overjoyed when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted because of the name of Christ, you are blessed, for the Spirit of glory and of God rest on you. If you suffer, it should not be as a murderer or a thief or any other kind of criminal or even as a meddler. However, if you suffer as a Christian, do not be ashamed, but praise God that you bear that name. And it's interesting that you bear that name Christian. There's only 3 places in the New Testament where the word Christian is used, and this is one of the 3. And it initially Christian wasn't a compliment; it was an insult to call somebody a Christian. And so um, it provides an opportunity, and for us to be ready when that time comes. If somebody asks us of the reason for our hope, or why we follow Christ, or why we're a Christian, what does that mean to us? We need to be ready with an answer. But the other thing we need to do is, I think we've all had times when we say, oh, I should have said this, or I should have answered that way, or I missed that opportunity. And that's where we really just need to prepare ourselves with prayer. Because if we're praying for individuals by name that we work with, or in our neighborhood, or friends, neighbors, family, whatever it is, if we're praying for them and asking God to give us an opportunity to speak to them, then when the opportunity arises, we'll be ready. Or even if we're just saying, Lord, send me somebody today that I can share my faith with, then when that opportunity comes, we won't be surprised by it and we won't miss it. But we have to be ready. We have to prepare ourselves mentally and through prayer. So if somebody calls you a cheesehead, then wear it proudly. If somebody calls you a Christian, then say, "You betcha," and tell them why. God bless you. Have a great day. Go get them, church.